welcome everyone. And I'm going to, when we run these webinars, we tend to follow a consistent agenda. We provide an overview, and then we go into what we describe as the three pillars of trust architecture, the social context, the business context, and the technical context. And so I'll kind of be going through each of those through the process. And one of the things to mention is that I have pulled a lot of material from our pilot webinar back in December, because community activation programs the idea is to run several pilots for the ecosystem that you're working in. And so there was a lot of material that was reusable from that. And also, if you'd like to learn more, you can check that out on the YouTube channel. As Rochelle said, we do think that the release of 0.7 for public comment and the upcoming public review, or the upcoming release of 1.0, means that this is the opportunity to start building momentum on top of a stable protocol and specification. So the idea of 0.7 is that it's a pre-release of the 1.0 version. And what that I think means for folks who are interested in interoperability, in transparency, and in solving some of these structural problems that industries have faced, is the time to kind of get started is now, because the protocol is stable and will be stable for time to come as we hit 1.0. And so But the question is, if we're starting to look to take a step forward, how do we do that? Where are those opportunities? What are the first steps to take? And that's really the focus of this conversation. And so on this next slide, I'm talking about this, what we call the uh, UNTP implementation tree. And at the top of this tree, and this is a new image that's been added to um, the UNTP site, um, is the community activation programs, and we'll be talking. That's our focus today. It's what we're going to be talking about, and even more. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk about even more drilling down into the start of a community activation program. I'll walk through what a whole program is, but how do you start one? Because getting started is, I think, the most important step here. Um, but I do want to kind of elaborate on how a community activation program plugs into UNTP and how these pieces fit together. And that's kind of the focus of this, because putting the pieces together, I think, is the key role of this community and of the trust architecture community, and what the people out in the marketplace will be looking for from us. And so the idea of this implementation tree is the UNTP is one core protocol that people build on top of. And by starting with a core protocol and extending out, we are able to maintain interoperability. And that maintaining of interoperability, even as we're solving some of the structural challenges in the marketplace, is the key value proposition of this step. And that core protocol is governed by the UN open development process. It's developed by a group of international volunteers. There are 4 working groups underneath that core protocol, but that is what has been released for public comment. And that is what the implementations and the community activation programs will be built on top of. Um, One of the other sort of core concepts that the UN is doing is this idea of international collaboration forums. So how do we get consistency and learnings and collaboration where there's overlapping needs? And so the international collaboration forums is sort of that ecosystem to discover other community activation programs, other people doing like-minded things. But it is not really a place that is going to define any extensions. It's a meeting place and a marketplace, but not a not a definite, not a place where things will get defined, not a place where extensions will get defined. Where that work occurs is in the community activation program. Um, but at the bottom are the roots, are the implementations of UNTP, and this is where the actual technical definitions come together. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward in a later slide. The other thing I kind of want to flag here is we think there will be thousands of community activation programs around the world. The UN has no business just being involved in discussions in Australia about agriculture or about mining. It's Australia business. What we want to make sure of, though, is that as people here in this local economy make decisions about how they're going to share information, that they are also able to share that internationally so that they don't have to do the same work twice. And so that's kind of where this idea of the community activation programs being local and regional and driven from the bottom up is the key idea. In terms of a community activation plan stages, the idea is that you go through a maturity so that you don't feel like you need to do everything all at once. And so we're going to really be talking about the inception of community activations today. But it's worth sort of recognizing that this is a journey you're going on and a journey you're going to be taking your community on with you. And so the way we describe the phases is the inception phase, the discovery phase, alpha phase, beta phase, and live phase. And the sort of gates for going from inception to discovery is that in inception, you think there's maybe a community, and you're kind of building the case to actually do some real work. In the discovery phase, you're really starting to bring together the constituents and starting to prove out the value proposition. In the alpha phase, you're delivering pilots and outcomes. And in the beta phase, you're starting to see real live implementations. And then in live, it's a live protocol that is actively used in the community. Um, and this sort of journey, I think, is pretty common. But I think it's helpful to help people understand that you don't have to do a full production rollout from the start. You can kind of have some go, no go decisions at each stage. Um, that's all kind of high level, but when you're building a community activation program, what are you actually putting together? And so the core idea here, and I'm kind of bringing back our UNTP implementation tree, is that a community of businesses of different types of organizations get together to build technical outcomes that meet the needs of that constituency. And so the organizations, and I'll go into that on the next slide. We have a more detailed definition of that. But basically, the core idea is the community activation program brings together the community of ecosystem actors with the businesses that have different roles to build some technical implementations that are UNTP compliant. Um, and I kind of want to ground this at this point. I've got building products up there, but probably the most famous example of what we envisage with community activation programs. Now, this community is not yet UNTP compliant. I don't know if anybody's actually talking to them, but it's an example that's useful to kind of bring forward, and that's the champagne industry in France. So that industry association trademarked the word champagne, and they've now ensured that around the world nobody can use that word unless they belong to the champagne community and have met certain criteria. And so they got together as a community and they defined the rules that meant that only they could use that phrase. And what we imagine with community activation programs is that we're doing something similar, but for our domestic context and solving for not a brand problem, but for the interoperability challenge that people are facing on a day-to-day basis. And so the types of organizations that we see being people bringing together as part of a community activation program are a member association is kind of maybe might be the convener of a community activation program. The producers, the manufacturers, the brands, they're the ones who are actually going to implement the protocol. Regulators, if they're relevant, but usually easier than regulation are the scheme owners, the conformity assessment bodies, the registry operators, and the software vendors. And so scheme owners, the core idea there, if we go back to our champagne example, the champagne scheme is you must, in order to use the trademark champagne, you must produce from a particular region of France, and you can only use certain grapes. And I think there's also sort of a quality measure about the number of the bubble size and things like that. That means it's a champagne from that region. And so that's a scheme. And then the certification of that scheme is that the scheme is defined, and then the certification is yes, you can use the word. And so that process is done by conform scheme owners do define the scheme, and conformity assessment bodies provide the certification that you've met the standards of that scheme. And then registry operators is things like identifiers, how you discover information. So in retail products that are sort of at the supermarket or at stores, the identifier scheme is typically the product identifier. But um, in things like agriculture, like Australian, the red meat sector, the identifier of cattle are not a barcode. They're not they're a national livestock identifier scheme. And so each community can define what identifier schemes make sense for them. And then the software vendors are the people who actually do the technical work to implement it. But importantly, in a uh, um, community activation program is building the business case to start off with. And so from our perspective, we always start with the two sides of the business case. Value is created when a supplier sells a product to a buyer. And where UNTP can add additional value is by either allowing a supplier to supply a similar product at a lower cost or higher value. And from a buyer's perspective, you might pay for something a little bit more if it means that you can produce your products at a lower cost or sell them at a higher value, right? And so the ways that we sort of identify value is these are some of the kind of value activators that we see. Um, but what all of these have in common is it's powered by automated, in the UNTP context, is that this value proposition is powered by automated digital verification, where a lot of times these things are done today very manually and at, at at higher cost. And so if we can automate and increase the verifiability of this, then the value proposition can emerge. And so how we look at that is from the supplier side is standardize how you share information about your products and your facilities. And so that's the digital facility record, the digital product passport, and the traceability event, and increase the value of your products to your customers by simplifying how they get information about your product and how they pick your product. And what we anticipate is that businesses go on a journey. And so in the early phases of a community activation program, we recommend publishing what you currently share publicly about your facility products and production processes, um, and explore with your customers that value high quality data if there are any preferences they can provide. So you want to say, hey, here's what I do. I'm going to make it easier for you to consume. Does that add value to your business? And then on the buyer side, standardize how you receive information about products you purchase through the facility records, product passports, and traceability events, and explore how you might provide preferences to suppliers that provide high quality verified data. And so again, these is are, and then you can sort of build that over time into algorithmic validation of that information and increase the value that you receive, or that you realize as a result of this. And then the sort of exploration of these value propositions are what you can turn into a business case for the community to invest in achieving these kinds of things. And that's what that initial exploration of that value proposition is a big part of what we typically do in an inception phase of a community activation program. Now, from a technical perspective, one of the things we talk about are what are the first steps that you take from a technology side to implement or to start thinking about adopting UNTP. And because we're in the inception phase, we're not saying let's build a whole big system or platform or technical infrastructure. What are the first steps that a community should take when they're thinking about implementing UNTP? And so this is where I want to talk a little bit about the extensions model of UNTP. And I kind of want to go in, and what I want to talk about is one of the things that we found is that the UNTP Foundation um, is is designed to cover about 80% of an organization's needs when it comes to data interoperability, data standards, traceability, verification, discovering information. Um, but it doesn't cover the last 20% because the UN can't solve for every permutation of every industry, every community, every business, everywhere in the world. Um, and in fact, that's the role of the role of the community activation programs, and the role of this process. That being said, the majority of the value for a business is not on the 80% that is the same, it's on the 20% that is unique. This is organic cotton from Australian grown on a farm that is certified carbon neutral. That's a differentiated product where 80% of the information is the same across every cotton product delivered everywhere in the world. But the last 20%, the fact that it comes from a farm that has a carbon neutral certification and and is from Australia, is the piece that allows that producer to sell at a price that is higher than the commodity price, or allows them to build a market agreement with a customer that wants all of that product that has those specific features. And so the majority of the value is in that last 20%, which is where a community activation program is able to define the needs of that community around that value proposition. And so that's kind of the idea of the extensions process. And the extensions methodology is what we anticipate a community activation program going into. And so the first technical step of building an extension is to map the data. And so what we sort of articulate here is these five data elements are the five components of UNTP, and mapping the key data requirements or the key data elements to these five components is a very strong starting point to sort of say, oh, I can see how this meets 80% of our needs, and it also helps you validate the 10 to 20 or 25%. I mean, these are rough numbers. There's no precision here, but that you might need to adjust to meet the specific needs and the specific value propositions of your community. And so this is kind of the first step from a technical perspective of meeting the needs of your community, which is that final 20%, but building on top of that 80% so that interoperability is maintained internationally.